A moment from the past. Coatl's revenge. There were two cities, one called Tenochtitlan and the other Texcoco. These cities stood on opposite shores of a lake. At one time, the tlatoani of Texcoco was Coatl. The Altepetl and ruling Tlatoani Texcoco dynasty were extremely militant, but Coatl was strongly supported by his relatives, and this union was as solid as a block of basalt. Tlatoani Coatl had many wives, including his main wife, Axayacatl, and a Massahualtan named Izalli. Coatl, the current priest, judge, and tlatoani of the floating city of Tlaluacatli, was the son of Izalli and nearly 25 years older than his youngest brother, Tlaluacatli, son of Axayacatl. According to tradition, the youngest son became the ruler of Texcoco following the death of Coatl because it was believed the younger son would be able to rule the Altepetl longer. The two brothers did not get along with each other. They rarely met, although, following the precepts of their father, they were close friends with other members of their huge family. Despite the brothers' dislike for each other, they never reached internecine enmity, and this made their Altepetl, the ruling dynasty of the city of Texcoco, and its subordinate lands, the strongest in the triple alliance of the cities of Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan. Their father, Coatl, had believed until his last breath that the strengthening of Texcoco would one day make this city the capital of the Triple Alliance, although during his lifetime Tenochtitlan was discreetly considered as such. However, there was renewed life to his hope. After all, Tenochtitlan had been losing its former influence in the Triple Alliance over the last score of years. This was primarily due to a series of natural disasters, but also contrary to a request from Huitzilopochtli, as declared by the priests. Atotoztli, the mother of Axayacatl, the current ruler of Tenochtitlan, had given birth not to a boy who would strengthen their Altepetl, but a girl. Over the years, the people of Tenochtitlan murmured. People were dissatisfied with this fate, especially since other residents of the cities of the Triple Alliance were accustomed to pinning their hopes first on the weyitlatoani of Tenochtitlan, then his council, and only then on themselves and their local tlatoani. In his youth, when Coatl went to the Calmecac, a boy named Coatl studied with him. He came from the city of Teotihuacan, and they grew to notably dislike each other and eventually became true enemies. The Calmecac students were severely punished for fighting, but Coatl and Coatl often fought anyway, always finding new reasons, from a careless word to merely a sidelong glance. After Coatl and Coatl finished their studies at the Calmecac, they no longer saw each other. Coatl became one of the priests in his city of Teotihuacan and a judge in the Tecali court, and Coatl held similar positions in Texcoco. When Coatl was 36 years old, he was already beginning to get tired and believed that his life would soon come to an end. But then, an amazing event happened to him. Axayacatl, who had already long been the weyitlatoani of Tenochtitlan, invited prominent men of his state to his palace. The weyitlatoani's need for educated and experienced people was growing because his state was constantly expanding. He intended for them to help him subordinate the inhabitants of newly acquired lands to the Tenochtitlan way of life and force them to adopt the traditions of Aztlan. This time Axayacatl decided to have some fun. He ordered his Coatl to depict the names of new positions on pieces of amatl, roll them up, and, not knowing which position was on which amatl, he would distribute them to each of the invited guests. That was how it was explained to Coatl. On the night of a full moon, the guests gathered in the main hall of the palace and were placed in several rows. Ceremonial fires burned everywhere in clay bowls. Through the hum of voices filling the hall, Coatl heard the neighbor on his right hiss.
"Ah, you are here, son of a Massahualtan."
Coatl looked at the neighbor to find Coatl leering at him.
"Just wait till you must wash my feet and drink the water."
Coatl continued. The blood rushed to Coatl's head. He clenched his fists and, just like a decade and a half ago, rushed at the enemy of his childhood. but suddenly a loud exclamation interrupted them.
Tonatiuh kuautik.
The greeting was uttered by Axayacatl himself, weyitlatoani of Tenochtitlan, as he entered the hall. Axayacatl's favorite obsidian translucent blue dagger, glinting in the firelight, hung from his belt. The weather was cool, and his body was covered with a cloak made of a dense, luxurious turquoise fabric with black geometric patterns. Axayacatl's head was decorated with a head wrap made of the same fabric, gathered on the side with a lush knot of scarlet ribbon. His feet, shod in sandals with the same scarlet knots, noiselessly stepped on the stone slabs of the floor. In his right hand, the ruler held a staff decorated with tufts of feathers. Gold rings and earrings hung from his nose and ears, and a huge gold plate hung on his chest, decorated along the sides with drawings and precious stones. The plate depicted a pyramid with 2 temples on top. An eagle flew to the right of the pyramid, holding a snake with its claws, and a large cactus grew to the left. Axayacatl's retinue dressed in a similar way, but the colors of their clothes were much more muted, and the jewelry they wore still made it possible to distinguish their faces. The great tlatoani ascended to the dais in the center of the hall and addressed his guests.
Oh, most worthy men, you know why you were called here, and I needn't repeat myself. At this time, each of you will receive from me a certificate with the title of your ticitl, your appointed position of service. You will not unfold the letters until I order each of you to do so.
Axayacatl, without looking back, reached his hand behind, and the attendant put the first scroll into it. The weyitlatoani approached the nearest guest and handed the scroll to him. In this manner, he went around all the rows, and Coatl and Coatl received their scrolls. Once he had finished distributing the certificates, Axayacatl returned to his dais and looked curiously at the faces of the guests. This was a performance for only one spectator, the great tlatoani. The spectacle he had prepared for himself promised unprecedented excitement. Now he would be able to see, one by one, the expressions of all human feelings as they were experienced.
And now,
Axayacatl proclaimed,
each of you in turn, starting with the one who received his scroll first, will unroll it and read aloud, at the top of his voice, his ticitl.
Axayacatl tried but couldn't hide his grin. At that moment, the earth shook and a rumble resounded. Ornaments, lamps, and dried heads of predators began to fall from the walls. Axayacatl looked at his retinue with horror and was the first to rush toward the exit of the palace. The retinue rushed after him. Only one person, a warrior with terrible scars and nasolabial folds on his face, managed to shout,
"To the exit! One at a time! Strictly one by one, run!"
But the man was already being crushed by the maddened crowd, full of the best men of Aztlan. An earthquake had begun, and each of them knew well what it was. Someone was rushing at full speed, lifting the hem of his festive robe to his knees. Someone was limping but still running, spewing curses in impotent rage, and others were already buried under the weight of falling walls, painted columns, and stones from the ceiling. At the exit from the hall, people trampled each other in a terrible crush, regardless of their faces and ranks. The doomed swore, fought, and cried. One of the columns fell directly on Coatl, who failed to get away from it as it fell. Crushed only his right leg, but that was enough. The pain was so intense that Coatl immediately realized that his death was imminent. Only a miracle could save him. Coatl saw Coatl rush past, but then suddenly froze in place. Coatl's hatred was very strong. Even now, as the walls continued to fall, and there was no one left in the hall, Coatl's whole being was calling him to escape, to save himself, to live, but he stopped near his defeated enemy and looked him in the face. From out in the city and inside the hall came the terrible screams of citizens who were being buried alive by the earthquake. In some places, people were writhing in agony under the slabs of luxurious carvings. There were many dead, Coatl picked up a piece of stone decoration that crowned one of the columns and with an effort raised it over his head.
No!
Coatl shouted a heart-rending plea.
No need! My father will make you a rich man! I will work for you for the rest of my life! I will wash your feet and drink the water!
Oh, what a moment of sweet revenge it was, which is not granted to every mortal on this earth. Coatl screamed and slammed the stone on the head of Coatl. The man fell silent. His head became a terrible mess of blood, hair, skull fragments, and the colorful ribbons with which Coatl had adorned himself. Coatl's hands relaxed, and he released the scroll he had received from the weyitlatoani. Coatl knew he had nothing left to lose. His fate would be decided at this moment. The bustle and horror that had engulfed the whole city suddenly ceased to exist around him. He unrolled the scroll he received from Axayacatl and read,
Selection and counting of slaves of the Coatl tribe and their delivery to festivals in Aztlan. Training of those who agree to celebrate festivals together with the residents of Aztlan.
Coatl grimaced. Even if this earthquake had not happened, he would still have resigned or claimed to be crippled, sick, or crazy. He wanted no more of the dreary, everyday life he had experienced in his many years of service. He picked up the bloody scroll that had fallen out of Coatl's hand, unrolled it, and read,
Tlatoani of Tlaluacatli.
Coatl had a vague idea of where the city of Tlaluacatli was located. However, the position of tlatoani meant that there would now be possibilities of promotion and free competition with the tlatoani of other cities. If he could manage to subjugate this unknown city to the influence of his family, he could further strengthen the Altepetl of Texcoco. With this credited to him, he could benefit from the division of even higher positions, vacated from time to time due to natural causes. If Coatl, as tlatoani of Tlaluacatli, could also manage to subject other cities to this, he may well become as strong as his brother Nezahualpilli, tlatoani of Texcoco. The noise of falling walls and the cries of people and animals had already diminished within the palace, and now only the groans of crushed and dying people could be heard. Coatl suddenly heard the treacherous murmur of water rushing up toward the walls of the palace. The water began to permeate the inside, and the flood began to pick up pieces of furniture and move the dead from their places. Their bodies, caught up in the current, moved in the most nightmarish ways. Coatl climbed up the rubble that remained of the wall of the great hall where the festive ceremony had taken place only a few minutes before. From the top of the crumbling wall, illuminated by the bright light of the moon, he could see streams of water, dirt, and garbage flowing through the streets of the huge, once magnificent city. Somewhere in the distance, a fire started, and black smoke billowed over the dirty water filled with debris. Coatl was as calm as he had ever been in his life.
I hope,
he thought at that moment,
there will be no water in Tlaluacatli.
Chapter 12. The Caravel. Coatl strode along the deck of the floating city, followed by Nuno, Anacaona, and Duke Fernando de Braganza. Ocotlan and a couple of his warriors brought up the rear. Ocotlan did not like de Braganza from the very beginning, and he did not take his eyes off the Duke. The Duke and Nuno hardly had time to turn their heads. There was so much to take in. The Duke realized that no matter how stable this bamboo ship was, any military carrack could smash it into splinters with a couple of cannon volleys. It was not difficult to imagine what would become of its inhabitants after that, but still the Duke looked at them with interest. All the people looked like Anacaona, which did not surprise him. They were all clean and neatly dressed, and many wore jewelry made of gold, silver, and precious stones. The Duke could not help but admit that even people without jewelry looked much better than Portuguese sailors and peasants. At the same time, the Duke, no matter how little experience he had in crafts and agriculture, noticed the tools and techniques of the ship's inhabitants were quite primitive. It was also difficult for him to understand why the ship supported such a large farm that included a large herd of cattle. After all, wouldn't it be much easier to simply load the necessary supplies onto the ship? He also noticed how both working and living quarters were kept perfectly clean here. The bamboo forest also stunned the ship's guests. Anacaona had difficulty explaining to them why growing a forest was better than a supply of cut bamboo. The well-groomed, neat paths in the forest made a particularly strong impression on them. The contentment of these people was reflected in their faces. They were swarthy and not always beautiful, but always friendly. Nuno and the Duke saw them greeting each other this morning, holding hands, and sometimes even sitting down together in a convenient place. At the sight of the Duke in his black armor, they were frightened, but promptly a smile stretched across their lips again. Nuno noted how much better the local girls looked than their peers from Portuguese villages who by the age of 15 were already beginning to fade, the stamp of worry and eternal fatigue appearing on their faces. These same dark-skinned beauties with unique tattoos on their faces were always neat, smiling, and glowing. They were dressed quite lightly, but Nuno never perceived any lustful glances from men aimed in their direction. They themselves wore only loincloths, and Nuno surreptitiously envied their attire. He would not mind walking like this most of the year. After looking at all these curiosities, the Duke assumed that the inhabitants of the ship had sailed here from Africa, from places that Portuguese sailors had not yet reached. He remembered how he had said in the Cortes in his own city of Evora that spending money on sea voyages meant throwing it away. The Duke had assumed that the civilized Portuguese would need little from India or any other, what he considered savage countries. Their spices were too far away and unnecessary, whether it was essential to sail after them or wander across dry lands. However, those same savages would need a lot from Portugal, so let them come themselves. Most likely, the Duke guessed this is exactly what had happened. When the Europeans were approaching the house of Coatl, the Duke managed to whisper,
"Nuno, you will be my interpreter. You will translate everything I tell him, and you will not ask me questions. No questions at all, Nuno. Even if I have to deceive this person, you are only to translate, and in no case dispute my statements. If you want to keep your noble rank and estate, you will do just that."
The more Nuno got to know the Duke, the less he liked him, and yet the young man decided that it was better to accept his situation. He decided to comply with the Duke's demand but did not answer him. The Duke was enraged by Nuno's silence, but he understood that he was in a very precarious situation, and he did not have command now. Until the king was deposed, Duke Fernando de Braganza could only ask, and it wasn't worth putting pressure on Nuno either. The young man had just lost his family and was unlikely to recover quickly from such a blow of fate. The decorations in the house where they brought the Europeans seemed too modest for the commander of a floating city. Entering his chambers, Coatl sat down on a low wooden bench and motioned for the guests to sit down also. However, the Duke could not sit comfortable in his armor, so he remained on his feet, and Nuno and Anacaona followed suit. The conversation began, and Nuno began to translate with the help of Anacaona and many of his drawings and notes.
"I am tlatoani of Tlaluacatli,"
said Coatl.
"He's the leader of this city on the water."
Anacaona suggested to Nuno.
"I am the master of the land you came to,"
said the Duke.
"Who are your Tito?"
Coatl asked.
"We have only one God. His son lived in Jerusalem, a city to the east, but now he, too, is already in heaven, having suffered for all of us."
Nuno replied, after which the Duke and Nuno crossed themselves. Coatl began to guess the Ocotlan Tito could be anyone living in the sky, but if the Metzli didn't know them, then they couldn't possibly celebrate the same festivals. There was nowhere else to go. They had reached the place from which the sun always rose. So, Huitzilopochtli is definitely not here, and no one knows anything about him.
"What is the name of your land? Africa or India?"
asked the Duke.
"Their country is called Aztlan,"
Nuno answered. Coatl, hearing the familiar word, nodded. The Duke did not ask the priest for details. He had already decided that these people came from Africa and continued to consider them Africans.
Why did you come to my land?
He asked.
That reason does not concern you.
Coatl replied.
Because you don't participate in our festivals, and you, the tlatoani of your land, will have to pay tribute to me and make your land part of my Altepetl and the land of Aztlan.
The Duke had learned to control himself in the face of mortal danger even in his adolescence. But now, he had to restrain himself from laughing. It turned out to be much more difficult, but the Duke coped. He asked,
What kind of tribute do you require?
Coatl pointed to the Duke's armor and sword.
The metal from which that is made.
Coatl then pointed his index finger at the corner of the room. The Duke looked and realized that there was a pile of weapons the foreigners had managed to collect on the shore. Swords, crossbows, and even one arquebus. These weapons were undoubtedly taken from the soldiers of the Lyria garrison, who, according to Leandro's reports, disappeared in recent days. Coatl looked proudly at the Duke again. De Braganza almost laughed again when he realized how highly this half-naked man appreciated an ordinary soldier's weapon. Indeed, Coatl now imagined what envy this quarry would cause from his brother Nezahualpilli and all of Texcoco and Aztlan. The Duke was also calculating. Of course, there would be no question of any tribute, exchange, or trade with these savages, but they would have to be enticed at all costs to attack the castle of St. George and capture the king, and immediately, while the garrison of Lisbon was still besieging the Duke's fortress. By that time, the army from Porto should arrive. Fernando still believed this. Then, the savages could be taken out of the city and killed. After that victory, the Duke's soldiers would sail here, take all the gold, even that from which the African savages made dishes, and burn this bamboo vessel. There was enough gold here to buy off the entire army of Castile in case it wasn't possible to capture the king right away and real soldiers were needed instead of mercenaries.
I agree.
The Duke said.
But you'll have to help me as well.
How am I supposed to help you, tlatoani metzli tlapali?
Your warriors will help me capture a castle. It is my castle, but now my enemy is sitting in it. An enemy who captured it by force, without any right to do so.
Nuno couldn't translate the word, castle, because Anacaona didn't understand the meaning of that word. So he said, city, instead.
How many warriors does your enemy have?
50.
The Duke replied.
And if you and your warriors capture the castle, I will perpetually pay tribute to you with such weapons and the metal from which they are made. I have an excess of such metal, and you will not be lacking in it. I will also assign you craftsmen who will teach your artisans how to handle the metal and make these weapons with it.
Coatl did not notice how Ocotlan, who had been in the corner of the room all the time, broke into a wide smile. It was obvious that he liked this offer very much, but Coatl's eyes also lit up, although not a single wrinkle trembled on his face.
If that's the case,
he said after a pause,
then I need not talk with you but with the one to whom your city belongs now. After all, he must be stronger than you.
You are correct, good man.
The Duke said humbly.
But the current lord of the castle has gone mad. He will not accept any people who want to talk to him and gives orders to kill anyone who approaches the fortress, whomever it may be. He does not want to talk and negotiate with anyone, but you can negotiate with me.
Nuno had not expected to have the skill with which he was now translating the speeches of Coatl and the Duke and surprised himself. Anacaona hardly had to help him. Nuno's soul began to fill with excitement and anticipation for revenge. He had no doubt that the Duke and the priest were now talking about the fortress of Lyria and about avenging the deaths of his father and mother. When he translated the Duke's last words, a snake-like smile flashed on Coatl's lips, but immediately his face became calm again.
My warriors can defeat 50 men.
Coatl said.
I can put 10 times 50 warriors in line right now.
Then,
replied the Duke,
we must hurry because the enemy has called for help, and soon he will have 30 times 50 warriors.
Therefore, we will hurry.
Coatl replied. Having agreed, the Duke and tlatoani began to discuss the details of the upcoming campaign. When the Duke and Coatl had agreed on everything, the priest summoned the Coatl of the Tlaluacatli, Chimalli. Coatl ordered him to prepare the floating city of Tlaluacatli to follow the Duke's big boat, and informed the Duke.
When my men are ready for Tlaluacatli to follow your big boat, they will tell you.
However, Nuno was beginning to suspect something was wrong.
Can you explain, Your Grace?
He asked the Duke.
Where such a large army will go?
To my castle.
De Braganza chuckled and turned away. This didn't explain anything to Nuno. Why would they aim to take the fortress of Lyria? In any case, it was now clear to him that there was no intention to fight for Cinta. As Anacaona stood next to him, he became even more bewildered and torn. He didn't want to part with Anacaona. He would rather stay with her on this ship and not return to the Duke's caravel. Nuno told Coatl about this. He agreed. Coatl understood that it would be beneficial to have one weyitlatoani hostage in case the strange tlatoani in black metal Ichkawapili wanted to escape or deceive Coatl. Besides, this young weyitlatoani spoke the language of Mexica quite well. Meanwhile, the Duke, accompanied by Ocotlan, went to the docks. There he boarded a boat with the sailors, who exchanged their knives for several gold trinkets, and the boat sailed toward the caravel. The Duke was tired as hell, and he desperately wanted to scratch his back, but his armor prevented him from doing so. Still, de Braganza was glad. He had fooled the leader of these savages. He was about to corner the king and force him to reckon with not only the Cortes but also with the best men of the kingdom. However, the plan of attack and all the details still had to be devised.
Nuno,
Anacaona said when the Duke left Coatl's house.
I want you to meet my father.
Chimalli disappeared with you, Anacaona.
Coatl said sharply.
The warriors that were in the boats that went to the shore presumed you were stolen or ran away.
I haven't seen my father since the warriors and I landed.
Anacaona replied, confused. How did this happen? When Anacaona had seen the warriors' boats leave the shore for the sea, she had assumed her father had sailed with them, but it turned out that he had stayed there, alone. He would surely face trouble from these terrible people with their sharp macuawitl and spears and their constant readiness to use them. She had become convinced of this at Nuno's house.
Coatl,
She exclaimed.
Order for me to be taken ashore too, the next time we go there. If my father is there, I have to find him. We will definitely have wounded if we go to the city of this weyitlatoani, and I can take the place of my father in almost everything. I will treat the wounded. I also even know how to ride those big animals that the weyitlatoani ride. He taught me.
And Anacaona nodded at Nuno. Coatl thought about it. It had not escaped his attention that Anacaona and this young weyitlatoani, whom she had brought to Tlaluacatli, showed a fondness for each other. In addition, although she had been on the shore of Ocotlan for only a short time, the warriors headed there would be completely unfamiliar with the land. Even a little of Anacaona's experience could come in handy. In addition, she already understood a little of the language of weyitlatoani.
All right,
Said Coatl.
but stay together. You will go ashore with the warriors.
Anacaona and Nuno smiled, grasped each other's hands, and left the house, heading into the bamboo forest. After seeing the Duke off, Ocotlan returned to Coatl's house. He was perfectly able to hide his feelings and put any mask on his face, and he usually chose a stone one.
Coatl, it's a trap.
He said in his usual big voice that caused the dishes on the tables to rattle.
Didn't you see the eyes of that weyitlatoani? Didn't you look into his soul? He didn't come with good intentions. He wants to lure us away and destroy our warriors.
Coatl went to the table and poured 2 mugs of Ocli from a jug. He handed 1 mug to Ocotlan and took another for himself. Coatl drank, put the empty mug on the table, and said,
Calm down, Ocotlan. This weyitlatoani has no need to conquer us. After all, he didn't know anything about us until he got here.
But now he knows.
Ocotlan roared.
He needs something else entirely.
Coatl said and looked at the bamboo forest through the window.
We're going to the shore. There, our warriors will land and go to his city where our guest is the legitimate tlatoani. Another tlatoani has captured it and does not want to give it back, so we will go there and conquer this city. He needs us to help him become the tlatoani of his city again, but we will do what we do with all the new cities of Aztlan. He and his lands will join my Altepetl, and you.
Coatl paused. Ocotlan listened attentively and politely restraining a belch from the intoxicating drink.
And you will become the tlatoani of this city and its land, Ocotlan.
Coatl continued.
Because as soon as we take the city of this tlapali, we will kill both him and the one he asks us to fight against, and then we will find out without both of them where they mine their metal.
I don't believe there are only 50 men guarding his city.
Ocotlan said.
We were there with you, Coatl. And in the distance, we saw many other warriors. They walked around the field or rode on their big animals. If there are so many of them out in the field, there should be even more in the city because the city is much more important.
This tlapali has no choice, but he has no need to deceive us either.
Coatl replied with confidence.
That's why he came to us, and if he said there are 50 warriors there, then there are 50 of them. It's clear, but if we delay, there will be many more of them because help is already coming to them. Don't delay, Ocotlan. Watch how the warriors will prepare for our new military campaign.
Nuno and Anacaona walked around the floating city, and she showed Nuno things he had not had the opportunity to see before. He was especially struck by the bamboo pipes under the ceilings from which everyone could get as much water as they wanted at any moment. It was so easy. Nuno firmly decided that when he restored his estate, he would definitely arrange the same type of plumbing in it. Passing by the neat garden beds, Nuno noticed large red fruits. He was sure that everything that grew on earth was available in Sinta's gardens, but he had never seen such fruit as this.
Tomato.
Anacaona said and plucked off a tomato. She simply wiped it on the sleeve of her dress, bit off a piece, and handed Nuno the other half. He took a bite of it and found he liked the flavor. Nuno was surprised that he had never seen a tomato in the markets of Leiria or even Lisbon. In one of the halls, they saw young people and boys playing ball. Noticing Nuno, the boys froze and looked at him, some with fright and some with challenging glares. Anacaona laughed and took Nuno's hand. The players came to life again. They came closer to Nuno, examined him, touched his clothes and, finally, his hands.
Nuno, play with them.
Anacaona said.
It's very simple. See the ring on the wall?
Nuno raised his head and saw the massive circle with a hole in the center, the edge of the circle attached to the wall.
Look!
Anacaona took the ball from one of the boys and forcefully hit the ball on her knee. The ball bounced off the leg, flew through the hole and fell to the floor. The crowd of players buzzed with delight.
That's how you play Alamalitzli,
Anacaona said. Nuno immediately joined the game. The ball turned out to be light and bouncy. Nuno couldn't figure out what the ball was made of, but he had no need to ask about it now. One of the players kicked the ball toward Nuno with his hip. He caught the ball with his hands on the fly and easily, as if he had been playing with it all his life, launched it into the circle. The ball went through it without even hitting the edges. Nuno mentally praised himself. But then Anacaona said,
Nuno, you can't take the ball with your hands.
Nuno looked at her with surprise. How then could he get the ball through the ring? Just then, a tall man in a beige cape, belted with a turquoise belt, came into the ballroom. It was Coatl, the Coatl of Tlaluacatli, whom Nuno had already seen at Coatl's house.
Everybody out. Tlaluacatli will be moving soon.
He turned and left without even looking at how the players would behave. They obediently went to the exit. Nuno and Anacaona followed them. Below the deck, where twilight reigned, there was a huge pool into which the players began to jump. Nuno thought that the players had decided to practice swimming, but they began to grab bunches of some kind of tough grass and rub their bodies with them. Nuno realized that they were washing, and at the same time taking a break from the game. It occurred to him that a ship with such facilities could not possibly be designed for transporting slaves, wars, trade, or any other purposes for which ships were usually built in his homeland. Of course, such facilities could only serve the people who work and rest here, who live in peace and joy. They continued down the stairs even lower. As Nuno's eyes adjusted to the twilight, he was able to make out the lower part of the ship. Light came in through narrow, long slits in the stern. The ship had two hulls. In fact, it was not one ship, but two connected by a common large deck on which the pyramid stood. At the end of each of the two hulls, a huge wheel with blades was spinning, beating on the water. These wheels were hidden inside the hull, so they could not be seen from the outside. Anacaona led Nuno to the stern of the hull they were currently on, and Nuno could see what was driving the ship. Dozens, maybe hundreds of people were constantly pulling up a rope that seemed to have no beginning or end. It came from somewhere out of the twilight and left into the dusk. This rope communicated with the mechanism, which then drove one of the wheels. Another team, in the same manner, pulled another rope inside the second hull and forced the second wheel to spin. It just so happened that while Nuno and Anacaona were watching, a man standing on a platform near the workers shouted something, and the wheel began to rise. As it rose out of the water, the ship began to turn because the other wheel continued to work. Despite the fact that the wheel removed from the water was now hanging in the air, people continued to pull the rope, and the wheel continued to rotate. Anacaona explained the wheel was always kept turning before being lowered into the water because otherwise, it would be impossible to set it into motion. Soon, the wheel that was removed from the water was allowed to sink back into the water. The ship stopped turning and went straight again. The man standing on the platform was the helmsman. As Anacaona explained, he was following commands that were transmitted to him from the temple room at the top of the pyramid. Anacaona didn't know for sure, but she assumed that these commands were transmitted by the same person who called the ball players out of the hall and into the pool, Coatl. He was Coatl's assistant and the second man on the ship. Nuno saw ropes hanging on the walls inside the hull. These were spares. In the event of a breakage of the working rope, it could be replaced immediately. There were also many women around who were weaving new ropes. Nuno had already seen the fiber from which they were woven. They were made from some vines and plants that wrapped around the bamboo above in the forest. Beside the rope, constantly in motion, pulled by these people, a row of bamboo trunks about half the height of a man protruded from the floor. They stood at an angle, and under each of the trunks, there was a large ceramic pot with handles. The end of each trunk was covered with long narrow slits, and the other end went down under the stern and into the water. Water entered the trunks and was forced up due to the forward movement of the ship. From time to time, as these pots filled with water, they were taken away by two attendants who threaded poles through the handles and putting them on their shoulders, left, leaving an empty pot behind. Some women then came to the ends of the trunks and put a mixture made up of ground leaves, vines, and some kind of gray powder inside through the slits. The ends were then wrapped with fine nets that held the mixture inside, and the water coming from below passed through this mixture before pouring out of the bamboo trunk and into the pot. Pots already filled with water were placed nearby, since there was plenty of room under the deck, and they did not interfere with the paddlemen. Different nets with another mixture and a portion of powder were then thrown into the pots with water. Anacaona explained to Nuno that after a few days, the water treated in this way would become drinkable, and the mixture inside the nets turns white and hardens. This mixture, which absorbed sea salt, was then simply thrown into the ocean. After this process, the water was poured into other pots and taken away. Trees and vegetable gardens could be watered with this water, and when mixed with rainwater, animals could also drink it. After watching the work of the paddlemen, Nuno and Anacaona went back on deck. Only now was Nuno able to see the pyramid up close. He had previously only seen it from the Duke's caravel. Seeing the steps, he invited Anacaona to climb, but Anacaona's face twisted in horror.
No, Nuno. You can't. You can't go up there. Only Coatl, Ocotlan, and Chimalli can enter there.
Nuno took another look at the pyramid. The pyramid was built of large steps covered with drawings. They depicted such terrible scenes that Nuno felt uneasy, and yet they were only drawings. But then Nuno noticed the strange wooden frame at the top of the pyramid. It was standing at the entrance to the room at the peak. Looking closer, Nuno saw that sticks were inserted inside of this frame and human skulls were impaled on them. Nuno looked at Anacaona with horror. She answered with a sad look and said nothing. Recovering from the shock, Nuno approached the side of the ship. He saw the caravel moving away in the distance, all the sails hoisted. It occurred to Nuno that Duke Fernando de Braganza could be standing at the stern at this moment and looking at them too. Suddenly Nuno realized that he did not want to meet him again, and he didn't want to return to his estate after all he had experienced either. He did not want to face the filth, malice, and greed, the abominations that he saw every day at his estate and in all the other places where he had to go. Besides, no one was waiting for him there. Yet there was one reason to return.
We will definitely find your father.
Nuno told Anacaona, watching the caravel. A strip of land appeared ahead as the sun began to set.